Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent, Holland, and welcome one and all. As I drove to the studio tonight, along my regular route, right across Lake Ontario, I was ever cognizant of its sheer beauty, of the scene and the enormity of the lake. I am ever grateful to have that ability to take all that in. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of choice going, relax in your most comfy chair tonight. Take this hour for yourself. You've worked hard. You deserve this hour for yourself. You know, a rabbinical rabbi once taught me that if you take a seed and plant it, then everything that grows from that seed, including new seeds right on down through generations, must be intrinsically connected to the original seed. So that means that you and I are connected. As a matter of fact, when Dr. Francis Collins was on the show, he led the team to break the genome. He told me that all DNA between us is 99% the same. Why we still insist on shooting each other, it's a topic for a whole different show. Now, think of the Big Bang, all that energy exploding in a millisecond. It also means that all the energy that ever was and ever will be was created at that very instant. It also means we are all energy, and energy is never lost. Like the seed the rabbi mentioned, all that comes from the seed means we are all intrinsically connected. Now, if all energy and consciousness is yet one form or expression of that energy, and given we have already proven we are all intrinsically connected through this energy, perhaps we can deduce there may be a universal consciousness we all contribute to. Perhaps there remains continued contribution of energy after death to that universal consciousness. After all, energy never dissipates, so perhaps there still is a communication from those from the other side, but unfortunately, perhaps in a form that our level of consciousness on this side can't yet comprehend. So, what if we are on this side and suddenly we find ourselves or a loved one incapacitated from a brain injury? That is what is termed a vegetative state. That universal energy is still there, but has that person left us? What are the perimeters for knowing to let that person go? Or to continue to communicate as if nothing has happened? The situation, of course, cannot be defined as black or white, yes or no, positive nor negative. It is somewhere in between. We enter what our guest tonight, neuroscientist Adrian Owen, has titled in his new book, The Gray Zone. A neuroscientist explores the border between life and death. Adrian Owen is currently the Canada Excellence Research Chair. I like that, Canada Excellence. Very nice, Adrian. Nice job. In cognitive neuroscience and imaging at the Brain and Mind Institute, Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. He has spent the last 20 years pioneering breakthroughs in cognitive neuroscience. He has also spent some time in my hometown of Montreal at the Neuro Center, we call it, part of McGill University, right near where the Owls play, by the way, for Canadian fans. And he told me he was a devout Habs fan, but has since become a London hockey fan instead. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Adrian Owen to the show. Thanks for joining us tonight. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much for having me on.
To start off, I wanted to read this wonderful, beautiful quote from the book, and it's very inspiring. Beyond the elegant experiments and dazzling technology, the heart of the gray zone science is about finding people who have been lost to us and reconnecting them with the people they love and who love them. Can you tell us about that statement and where it came from?
Sure. Well, it's actually it's one of the statements at the very end of the book, and in trying to summarize the story that I tell in the book, I really had to try and decide why it all ever happened. You know, what is it that determined why it happened? What drove each of us that was involved in the story, because this is I think it's a kind of an interesting story. It's a story about a scientific discovery, or about a series of scientific discoveries that involves a lot of people, a lot of patients with different types of brain injuries. And it wasn't really until I sat down and wrote the book that I started to think, well, how did all this happen? Why did it happen? What were the series of events that led me from being a young graduate student in neuroscience 25 years ago to being in this position where I'm communicating with people who are thought to be vegetative, using some of the most sophisticated brain imaging technology on the planet? And I think it does boil down to a desire to try and reconnect with people, reconnect with humans in a way that was, until very recently, completely impossible in this population of patients. And one of the themes that crops up time and time again in the book is what makes us a person. And I think what I was really trying to put across there is that there is something beyond our physical bodies that is required for us to be thought of as being a person, and it very much comes from our brain, and often it requires interactions with another person. It turns out that it's quite difficult to really maintain that sense of personhood if you don't move and you don't talk and you don't respond in the way that most of us do. And so I realized this was really a story about reconnecting with exactly what it is that makes a person a person.
Were you able to establish that? What makes a person a person? Is there a clear definition in your mind? I'll give you an example why. In the book you mentioned this young woman named Amy. And folks, just to let you know, I don't want to give too much of the book away, but essentially Amy was a young girl who came out of a bar, and her ex-boyfriend pushed her to the ground, and Amy became, quote unquote, in a vegetative state. Not so. They wanted to pull the plug on her, literally, the doctors that were attending her. They said, no, she's in a vegetative state. As a matter of fact, they were kind of arrogant about it, and jovial, that was the word you used. Were there sets of tests that you could do to establish the fact that there was still a person inside that shell that we call a body? And what were those tests?
So, essentially the conclusion I reach in the book is that you really do have to communicate with somebody to establish that there is a person in there. And we're not really talking about whether somebody is alive or dead. Obviously, somebody in a vegetative state is alive. Typically, these patients aren't being kept alive on life support systems. They're self-sustaining. You obviously have to feed them and hydrate them. But, we're not talking about a brain dead person here. They often move. They'll open their eyes. They'll look around the room. But they do lack some sense of personhood. There's something about them that it's hard to put your finger on, but they're not. They don't have, obviously. It's hard to determine if they have a personality or if they have attitudes or beliefs or opinions, because essentially they can't communicate any of that. And it all comes down to communication. And of course, what we found, and this is the story I tell in the book, is that some of these people very much have opinions and beliefs and attitudes and anger and frustration and love and, many of the most human aspects of being alive. But because they can't communicate that, you actually don't know. And Amy is a perfect example where when we broke through and we were able to say, hey, Amy, we think you're still in there. We think you're in a sense trapped inside your body, appearing to be vegetative, but actually fully conscious and inside. And she was able to return that signal and say, yes, hey, I'm here. At that point, suddenly a switch flipped. It switched for us, and it switched for her family, and it switched for everybody else. That suddenly she became a person again. And I think that's it's a really interesting and important concept, that language is so bound up with our ability to express ourselves as humans.
I want to get into Hitchcock in a second, but when you reached out to her, did you ever think about asking her if she wanted to stay in that state or if she wanted to be let go? Was there any way to communicate that question to her? My God, I can't even begin to think of that,
So we've done that, and I talk about a separate example. We didn't do that with Amy, but I talk about a separate patient, a different patient in the book where that actually happened. And if I can just explain a little bit about how this works, we put the patients into a scanner, an fMRI or functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and we know quite a lot about which bits of the brain activate when you think certain things. And all we do with these patients is we say, well, think this or imagine this particular scenario if you're in there. And that scenario is often something like, think about playing tennis, because when you imagine moving your arms around in a vigorous way as if you were playing a game of tennis, and forgive me, I'm not a tennis player, as you can probably tell, but when you think about doing that, you activate a part of your brain known as the premotor cortex that's involved in imagining these sort of big swinging arm movements. And the analogy I like to use is it's a bit like asking a patient, to squeeze my hand. Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. And if a patient does that, they're conscious, right? Everybody's seen that in a medical drama. Well, essentially, we say to the patient, imagine playing tennis if you can hear me. And if the part of the brain that we know is involved in imagining playing tennis lights up at exactly that moment, we have a piece of evidence that suggests the person's in there. And of course, we replicate it. We say, hang on a minute, now stop playing tennis now. And if the activation in the brain goes away, we have a bit more evidence. And then we'll wait a while and we'll say, start imagining playing tennis again. And the activity often will come back. And that's how we build up some confidence that this person is actually there, because they're making a response. Not a physical response, because that's their problem. They can't make any physical responses, but they are making responses with their brain. And as a neuroscientist, I can tell you that if you replicate that often enough and you are rigorous enough in the way that you assess it, then it can be just as reliable as asking a patient to squeeze your hand. And when it gets to that level of reliability, it becomes utterly clear that the patient is in there. It's then it's a small step to move this to a type of communication, because you can say, well, I'm going to ask you a question, and if the answer is yes, imagine playing a game of tennis. And if the answer is no, let's have another scenario. Let's imagine you're walking from room to room in your house. And very quickly, people find this actually quite easy to do, that somebody can answer simple yes and no questions. And that question could be the one that you posed to me. It could be, well, do you want to go on living like this? Imagine playing tennis if the answer is a yes, and imagine moving around your house is a no. And, obviously these sorts of things come loaded with a lot of ethical and moral issues that we and other people are trying to tackle. You wouldn't want to just go on a single response and act on it. We replicate things, and we make sure the responses are reliable. But at least in practice, it's entirely possible to do this now in an MRI scanner.
Heavy question for you. What would you want done if you found yourself in that state?
I would want one of my students to get a hold of me really quickly, put me into an MRI scanner, and start asking me these sorts of questions. And to be perfectly honest, you have posed exactly the question that I really leave people to think about towards the end of the book, and that is, the problem with this situation is none of us really know what we would want to happen to us until we get there, until we get into the gray zone. And I think that's a really important concept, because I'm sure everybody listening or watching this is going to be thinking or will have said at some point in their lives, if I ever end up like that, pull the plug. I never want to be in that situation. We've all either heard somebody say that or we've said it ourselves. But it turns out the facts aren't quite as clear as that. When you look at people who are in this condition or are in a similar condition, very often they report finding some level of satisfaction with their lives. And actually, the best data that we have suggests that very few of them would like to die. Now, that stands in quite a contrast to what most of us think we would want to happen. So my answer to your question, I'll get to it eventually, is I want to be put into a scanner and ask that question when I'm in the situation, because I know full well from the many, many patients that I've seen over the years that my opinion could well have changed, that what I want to happen when I'm actually in that situation may well be not what I think I would want to happen now, when I'm healthy and I'm talking and I can communicate effectively. So it's a difficult decision, and the question is unanswerable. But these sorts of technologies are offering us ways to allow these patients to do exactly that, to contribute directly to decisions that are made about themselves.
Real life case in your book, Juan. Now, poor Juan suffered, I think it was brain damage, and they wanted to pull the plug on him. They said there was not. The doctors that examined him said there was nothing left. He was in a vegetative state. His mother was reading something about you and decided to contact you to find out if there was any hope whatsoever, if there was some kind of consciousness still going on there. And thank God she did that. So you've got these doctors on one side that are just not aware enough and are willing to let the body go, if you will, let the person go. And then you've got you on the other side. Is there any way to educate the medical community that there is, in fact, tests now that can prove whether that person wants to live or die? I mean, it seems to be a big conundrum. Without question, I think of the poor people this summer that are going to be faced with that. Somebody, a loved one, I'm sure, is going to have a brain accident somewhere, either on a bicycle, water skiing, or something of that nature. What are the things those people should be aware of when they're in the emergency room and the doctor's urging them to let the patient go? What can you offer?
This is an extremely difficult. Yeah, they are big questions, and I am very fortunate. I'm a neuroscientist, so I don't have to make these difficult medical decisions, and I know they are difficult because I see many of my clinical colleagues going through this, and making those decisions, and I don't envy them for 1 minute, and I think it's a difficult job, and by and large, I think they make the right decisions, and in that context, it's important to realize that nobody has said that all of these patients are actually conscious or all of them can actually communicate. This is at most, it looks like about 15 to 20% of them have some level of awareness when they've had every clinical test on the planet to determine whether they are in fact vegetative, and that means entirely unaware. If you put them into a scanner, 15 to 20% of them actually will turn out to have some level of awareness, and many of those patients will go on to be able to communicate. So, in fairness, the vast majority of patients appear to be are what they appear to be, and the best guess we can have is that they have no sense of who they are and where they are and what's happening to them. But there are tens of thousands of these patients around the world because, of course, with modern medicine, they can survive for decades, and they are in nursing homes and in hospitals and in family homes, being looked after. And over years, this adds up to an awful lot of people, and 15 to 20%, turns out to be quite a number. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but it's a lot of people. So I think all of the science suggests is that we are now at a stage where, in many cases, a scan could tell you something that traditional clinical assessment, is not going to tell you. It doesn't matter how good a neurologist you are, how good a doctor you are. At some level, you can't get inside a patient's brain. And the fact is that techniques like functional MRI literally do get inside a person's brain. And that gives you something in addition. It doesn't replace clinical assessment. It doesn't do away with, traditional methods of assessment. And in many cases, that's adequate, and it does return the correct answer. But it's these sort of borderline or gray zone cases, as I refer to them in the book, where they slip through the net because they look, to even the well-trained eye, they look as though they are, completely not there at all. But actually, in the scanner, we learn something quite different. And I have complete confidence that these techniques will gradually trickle into more general clinical usage. But typically, these things take quite a while, often many years, before they become widely adopted. But it's happening slowly.
Very slowly, but thank God you're doing the work to do that. The book is called The Gray Zone. A neuroscientist explores the border between life and death. Our guest tonight, neuroscientist Dr. Adrian Owen, who operates out of the University of Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. I want to talk to you a little bit more about Juan, because Juan, I hate to use the word recovery because you said in the book you hate to use the word recovery. So I don't know what else to call it. But Juan did make some gains back. How's that? Is that politically correct?
Well, I think in Juan's case, you can use the word recovery. You have my permission. I don't know whether I can't remember whether I do in the book, but to my mind, Juan made a spectacular recovery. He improved to a point that I have never seen in more than 20 years in this field. I've never seen a patient do what Juan did. Really, he went from zero to hero in a course of about 9 months. He was, when he came to see us, when his parents brought him to us, he looked entirely vegetative. He had sustained a prolonged period without oxygen to his brain. And that's bad. That rarely ends up, well. Many of these patients die, and if they don't die, they are very, very severely disabled and often vegetative for the rest of their lives. Now, Juan, we threw the kitchen sink at Juan. We had him here in London for a week. We tried everything we had. We put him in the scanner. We tried some of our newer techniques. You mentioned Alfred Hitchcock, which we can discuss in a while. We used electroencephalography, another technique that we've used outside of the scanner to try and assess brain function. Nothing. It was very disappointing. As I sent Juan and his parents back to their family home, and I said, I'm sorry, but as far as I can tell, we've done everything, and he looks to me to be in a vegetative state. 9 months later, Laura, my lab manager, my research coordinator, called Juan's mother, and she was just following up. We always do. We like to stay in touch with our patients' families, and she said, how's Juan doing? And her mother said, and I relate this tale in the book, well, why didn't you ask him? And Juan was back. He was talking again. He was starting to walk again. He was brushing his teeth at that stage. He was thinking about going back to school. He certainly went on to do that afterwards. He had made an extraordinary recovery. Now, that's not something that's never happened before. This happens from time to time. What has never happened before, and I do believe this has never occurred in the scientific literature, and this is what makes him truly remarkable, is that when we started to probe his memory, my first thought was, well, does he remember anything about that period back in London, 9 months earlier? And I've been asked this question 1,000 times when I give talks about this work. People say, well, do any of these patients come around and then tell you about it? And Juan, not only could he remember being scanned at Western 9 months earlier, he could tell us down to the minutest detail what happened. He told me that one of my co-workers had a particularly odd-looking nose, and sure enough she does. And then he said, your student's name is Steve, and Steve has a really deep voice, and he does. And he said, and then you put these electrodes on my head to measure the electrical activity in the brain. To be frank, Juan remembered this event much better than I did. And and I had been walking and talking 9 months earlier at the time. He had been confined to a bed, completely non-responsive, apparently in a vegetative state. And I can think of no better evidence than Juan that this can happen, because we all hear stories like this, but actually when you dig deep, often they don't turn out to be quite what they appeared to be. And Juan, I've seen a lot of patients over 20 years, and Juan was he looked vegetative, yet he was witnessing every conversation around him. He was laying down mental notes of who was seeing him, what their names were, what they looked like, what their nose shape was, everything. Juan was absolutely there, entirely conscious and very aware of what was going on around him.
Now, his mom, I think her name was Marie, gave great credit also, not only to your team, but she said that the family gathered around him. They would stimulate him all the time, take him to movies, read to him, talk to him, and he remembered all this. But there was something that struck me. I'd read early in your book, you were writing about the more active parts of the brain receive more oxygenated blood. And then I was reading that his mom took him to a hyperbolic chamber where he would receive 3 times the amount of normal oxygen. Is there a correlation there?
Well, that's an interesting question. No, the truth is, no, that there isn't, at least to the extent that it's been clearly studied. Hyperbaric oxygen chamber is a treatment that's used typically for divers who get the bends, come up too quickly. They go into one of these chambers, and it's very effective, in that situation. There's some evidence that it's helpful in fighting infections for various reasons. But in terms of bringing somebody out of a vegetative state. No, there's no evidence that was the case. But, in Juan's case, he was fighting a lot of infections. He was on a lot of medication. His immune system was, going up and down. And so certainly there's a possibility that some of the treatments that his mother tried would have had some impact on his medical condition, which then could have had a knock-on effect to his general ability to to recover. Certainly, a sort of a broader answer to your question is about sort of feedback and really it's rehabilitation. In general, we know that when somebody has a stroke, for example, that might take out some of their responsivity in say their right arm, that rehabilitation or regular exercise and working through a series of exercises to get strength back into that arm and get that arm moving again can improve performance and can sometimes bring people right back to complete normal usage of that arm. Now, that's not something that's not, and this is something I return to many times in the book with my expression, "We are our brains." This is not something that you're not fixing somebody's arm there, you're fixing somebody's brain. The problem is the stroke is in the brain and it has affected the part of the brain that controls the arm. And when you're having rehabilitation on your arm, even though many of us sort of intuitively think about, well, you're getting your arm back, getting your arm fixed, it's your brain that you're fixing. It's the part of your brain that is driving your arm. And it may not be that we're actually fixing that part of the brain at all. And again, this is this sort of, as we call it, plasticity, is something that again I talk about in the book. It may be that other parts of the brain are taking over the functions that the bit that's now damaged used to do. So it may not be that you're fixing that part of the brain, but nevertheless, this sort of input and energy, for want of a better word, or this usage of this particular part of the brain, or at least the part of the brain that used to perform this function, is improving the situation for that stroke patient. And I think scale that up to a patient who's in a vegetative state. Think about a patient who's had extreme brain damage, a much more broader, at a much broader level than might be the case in a person who's had a stroke that's only affected their arm. And I think the same thing could apply, that exercising those functions, interacting with the person, getting them to think about their situation, socializing, all of these things that we know can affect brain function certainly could have a knock-on effect and could, at some level, impact the extent to which a patient might make gains.
The ability to trigger and use another part of your brain's function to achieve something that has been lost. In a stroke, for example, you talked about repetitive movements and physiotherapy and things along that nature. Does that initiation, that desire, have to come from the patient itself, or does that kind of just happen automatically? I hope that question was clear. Like, in other words, is the patient part of that, a desire to break out and fix themselves?
Well, this is something that Juan talks about a lot, and I tell his story in quite a lot of detail in the book because he's such a fascinating case. And he talks about, I knew I was going to get out. I just had to work at it. And when you meet this guy, he is one of the most determined young men you are ever likely to meet. And Kate, another case who recovered. I tell Kate's story early on in the book. She was the first patient that we ever scanned who also went on to recover. Again, I think I actually say this in the book. You will not meet a woman more determined, than Kate. And these people, and I can't tell you because we don't have the data, to exactly answer the question. Is the more involved you are, the more determined you are, directly related to your likelihood of recovery. But it's pretty clear that these people that come out of the grey zone are really special people, very determined, very sure that they're going to make it out, and very invested, in their own lives and in their own improvement of those lives.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent, Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. www.nightfrightshow.com.
Your book came at an opportune time. I was reading this article. I'm going to go esoteric on you for a second.
Please do, please do.
Okay. I tell you why. I lost a cousin 2 years ago, almost to the day, actually, today, from a brain aneurysm. And he was young 50s, and Warren, your family still thinks about you. God bless you every day. He ended up giving his organs, and there's 4 people alive today because of that. And people should do that without question, sign your organ donor card. I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, wait, ways to cure people. I'm always trying to problem solve. So I was reading this article about DNA. Here we go, back to Dr. Collins again. And apparently they've just stored an encyclopedia's worth of information on this little DNA self, or whatever you call it. So here I am thinking about computers, and my computer was screwing up, and I was thinking about going back to a previous version of Windows 10 because the new one was misbehaving. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could go back to a healthy version of ourselves and just reinstate that into our bodies? Is this science fiction? Is this somewhere where we may be headed? Is this even feasible?
I think, in very general terms, some of these things that you're saying are feasible. In a sense, that's the root of many branches of medicine. If you think about, the patient that I describe in the book who loses the ability to move. She's paralyzed from the neck down, and she has a device implanted in her brain that eventually allows her to reach out, grab a coffee cup, and move that coffee cup to her lips. And I've no doubt that the situation for that patient will return. Now, it's not that we're restoring her to, we're not rebooting her in the sort of, to use your analogy, to a sort of a former operating system, but in a sense we are patching up the operating system that we have and making connections that maybe didn't exist before. Other branches of medicine perhaps come a little closer. If you think about stem cells and you think about what's happening in situations like, in the sorts of treatments that people are investigating for neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, I think it's likely that where those diseases are concerned, the cure, when it comes, won't take the form of a medication. It won't just be a drug, at least not in the traditional form. It won't be like an aspirin or an acetaminophen that sort of takes away the pain. What it will be some kind of regrowth, regrowing of connections between neurons that are withered away. Something along those lines, more than a sort of traditional drug. And I guess in that sense, when you are maybe regrowing tissue or replacing tissue with new tissue, you're getting closer to the sorts of ideas that you're thinking about. So, I don't think it's science fiction in the sense that, this is never going to happen. I think it's science fiction in the sense that it's still in the future. But this is one of the going back to how you introduced this interview at the end of the book, when I was looking at how is it that we've come this far, I do reflect on exactly this, that really even in this, and this is only part of my career, when I first started scanning patients who were assumed to be vegetative, everything that we are doing now would have felt like science fiction, so much so that we didn't even think about it. It was just so unbelievable that we didn't think about it. So I think that the rate at which science fiction becomes science these days is incredible. Within one short career, things that most of us would never have believed possible are more or less the norm. And that's one of the great joys of doing science in the modern era, that you can experience that within one short career time.
We must be sharing some kind of symbiotic universal consciousness idea, because we're going to go from science fiction right now, and we're going to switch it from that movie right over to mystery. Let's talk about Hitchcock and how that came around. Now, just to let folks know, I interviewed Tippi Hedren, who was in The Birds. She was the main woman in The Birds, and she experienced some rather nice things, to put it mildly, from Hitchcock, but that doesn't take away from his work. There's a fascinating series that goes back to 1961 called Alfred Hitchcock Presents. It was a half-hour long, there was a very, very poignant and very serious show there called Bang You're Dead. And I'm going to let Adrian tell the story and how that came about and helped you create the benchmark. Thank you.
Well, once we established that some of these patients that appeared to be vegetative were actually in there, and we'd worked out how to communicate with them, it very quickly became evident that we're actually pretty bad at finding these people, at detecting them. And one of the reasons is that the things we were having to get them to do in the scanner were just so effortful. I mean, imagining playing tennis might seem pretty simple, but actually the way we do it in the scanner is we get people to do it for 30 seconds at a time, and then repeat that 5 times in a row. It's really, it's quite mentally taxing to do this. This is not something that, we can just trivially do. And because of that, it was pretty clear that many patients who maybe had some residual awareness were not able to perform these acrobatics, these mental acrobatics, as I refer to them in the book, while they're in the scanner. So we sat down and we thought, well, what we're really trying to do here is to determine whether this patient is their conscious experience of the world is like my conscious experience of the world. That's really what we're trying to get at. And how can we do that? Well, and this is where Alfred Hitchcock came in. Now, Alfred Hitchcock movies are very much like real life. Now, I'm going to have to explain that, obviously. And what I mean is that what he does is he really pushes the buttons on many of the sort of cognitive and mental activities and decisions that we make in everyday life. So typically, what I mean by this is that it's very plot driven. To follow a good Alfred Hitchcock movie, and most of them are good, you have to understand the relationships between the characters. You have to understand why one person feels this way about a different character. Bang You're Dead
as well.
Exactly, and Bang You're Dead has a story about a young boy who finds a real gun under his uncle's bed. He finds real bullets. He puts the bullets in the gun, and the tension builds up as he's wandering around the house. He thinks he's playing shoot 'em up cowboys, and the parents don't know he's got a real gun. They, out the corner of their eye, think he's got a toy gun, and you know he's got a real gun, but you also know that he doesn't know that it's a real gun. So you've got really sort of levels of analysis. And if, for example, you know that the boy knows that it's a real gun, it becomes a very different kind of movie. It's only really tense because you know that he thinks it's a toy gun, and these are very sophisticated mental processes that go on and allow us to understand these aspects of human behavior that one person doesn't know, only has some of the information that allows them to think the wrong thing and ultimately could end in somebody's death. And we realize that we might be able to show a patient something as simple, if you like, as a movie, and decode from their brain activity whether their conscious experience was like yours or mine. And by that I mean whether they were laying down memories, whether they realize that the child doesn't realize that it's a gun, whether they realize that somebody might well die, all of these things. And it turns out, I've probably overcomplicated it, because it turns out to be delightfully simple. And it works way better, I'm glad to say, with an Alfred Hitchcock movie than it does with many other types of movies. And what I mean by that is, if you put a group of people into a brain scanner and have them all watch that Alfred Hitchcock movie, their brains synchronize. You all start to think the same stuff. And I think what's going on is that you just get sucked into the movie. The movie literally hijacks your consciousness. And, we've all been there. We've all been in a movie theater and watched a really engaging movie, and you forget where you are. You forget your troubles. You forget what you've got to do tomorrow. You even forget the person munching popcorn behind you, because you're there in the movie. The movie has hijacked your consciousness. And when that happens,
you're in the moment.
You're in the moment, and people's brain activity all starts to move along in synchrony, because we're all thinking the same stuff, because the movie is pulling us along. And what we managed to do is to show that in some of these cases, some of these patients who are actually not vegetative but trapped inside their bodies, we could detect the same thing simply by showing them the movie. The patients who are truly vegetative, basically nothing much happens in their brain. When the guy comes out wielding the gun and you think, he's going to shoot somebody, they don't get that sense, because they've not put all the pieces together to realize that somebody's going to get shot. So their brain doesn't activate in the way that yours would and mine would, because you and I at that moment both go, we know what's going to happen, or we think we know what's going to happen. And whereas other patients, even though they were entirely non-responsive and clinically absolutely identical to the patients who are vegetative, we would look and we would see this little blip in their brain. We would see that, at that moment that the guy comes out with the gun, there's a little blip in the brain. And from that, again, now I've simplified it a little bit, but we were able to deduce whether or not a patient is essentially following the plot of the movie. And the leap I make in this chapter in the book is, if you can follow the plot of a complicated movie, then you can follow the plot of your life. Because a complicated movie, and that's what I mean by an Alfred Hitchcock movie, is just like real life. I don't mean that all of us are subjected to, flocks of birds attacking us in the middle of the night. Although life might be fun if that were the case. But, what I mean is that all the sort of twists and turns and attitudes and changes and things that happen in Alfred Hitchcock movie typically happen to a greater or lesser extent to us in everyday life. And those are the things that we're picking up in the brain.
I just laughed when you said that. And I was just wondering, comedy, I would suspect, is more subtle, right? It wouldn't have such a universal appeal because British humor is different than Canadian humor is different, and so on. Like French humor is different. So to establish that benchmark, Alfred Hitchcock makes perfect sense because everybody's terrified of a little kid not knowing he's got a real gun in his hand about to take that to a step further, perhaps. Watch the episode, folks. Okay, I want to talk about universal consciousness, and let's hope I can pull this quote up properly this time. Aha, here it is. The quote goes, "Collective consciousness has features in common with what some have termed universal or cosmic consciousness. Universal consciousness is said to be an infinite external ocean of intelligent energy. Each of us, each soul, each individual point of consciousness is a drop in that ocean. Where one drop ends and another begins is impossible to determine because there is no separation in the field of energy. As a metaphor, this description has some appeal. The consciousness that we each possess is a drop in the collective ocean. Exactly how we each contribute to the whole is certainly impossible to determine, however, in large part because much of our life emerges in a way that transcends each of us and our individual contributions. Life is a dazzling improvisation. We make it up collectively as we go along. That's what makes being alive so interesting. But working with people in the gray zone has shown me that it's vitally important to remember that just by being, each of us contributes to the emergent whole. That's beautiful. You're part poet, part philosopher. Can you tell us, can you just explain that to us or just comment on it? Better word.
Yeah. Well, so when I got to the end of the book, I realized that I had I had to reconcile two positions, really. And I think there are many people in the world that think of consciousness as being, almost some sort of, a metaphysical property of the world. And this is where expressions like universal consciousness or cosmic consciousness come into. I'm a neuroscientist, and that's not how I think about consciousness. I think about consciousness as being something that emerges from the complex machinations of our brains and the billions and billions of neurons that we have, and all of the sort of different functions and experiences that contribute into that. And I not only did I not want to alienate anybody by saying, well, you're wrong and I'm right, because who knows, that may not be the case. But I also wanted to try and explain how these two things could coexist in the world. And I did it in the context of a dinner party that I was actually at. And I talk in the book, I talk about, well, when you get to the end of a fun evening with, in my case, with three friends at a Parisian restaurant, you've arrived at a place that none of you could have ever predicted. You don't go out to dinner and say, well, by the end of this dinner, this is the attitude that I am going to have built up about the person sitting opposite me. This is the mistake I'm going to make about that person's past. This is the assumption that I'm going to erroneously make about whether or not he thinks this. All of these things that that contribute to a change in the state of the world are all contributed by us in actually a fairly sort of random, by each of us in a fairly random way. And that's how I explain this sort of sense of universal or cosmic consciousness coming out of the different contributions that each of us make that interact and collectively end up being something that none of us individually steers, guides, or could have ever really predicted. And that is what makes life so joyous. That happens, that we end up in situations that we would never have believed possible. In my case, I work in a fantastic field, and we get to do some really beautiful science in a way that I would never have predicted 20 years ago. And to trace that, you can only do that backwards. I could never have sat down and sort of worked it all out in advance. But then I make the analogy with neurons in the brain that I do say each neuron is not just a switch that's turning on and off. It's a tiny decision-making machine. And those tiny decision-making machines, when you've got many billions of them, produce, again, a very powerful, and some might say chaotic, sort of forward-moving machine. A machine that moves in directions and evolves in ways that one can't ever really predict. And we can't. I mean, just take the simple example of of growing up. That you take a child. Many of us have tried to predict what that child's going to be like, the sorts of attitudes they're going to have, the sort of how bright they're going to be, all these sorts of things. And most of the time, none of us can do it at anything better than chance. And that's because there are so many factors involved in that. So there are many levels at which this is true. Sorry, maybe making more of a meal of this than you wanted. But really, what I'm trying to say is that just because the output, the end game, is mysterious and amazing and incredible and unpredictable and almost seems random, doesn't mean that it can't be reducible to biology. It doesn't mean that it has to be it doesn't have to be mystical. It can still be reducible to biology, in the same way that the fact that you end up having a surprising conversation with 3 friends at the end of a dinner party, that doesn't have to be particularly mystical, even though it's quite hard to explain how you got there. You did. And you did because of each of you made a very specific set of contributions.
No, that's fair enough, and I get that completely. Thank you for that. It's a beautiful quote, by the way. I've got a couple of layman questions, actually. We were sitting around, and I was telling folks we were having a beer, okay, an IPA. I was telling the folks that you were coming on the show, and somebody said, okay, ask him this, because we were talking about a film, of all things, staying in the film realm. We could remember the name of the film, but not the actor. And each one, there was 4 of us sitting there. Now, it could have been the IPAs. I can't, I can't dismiss that. But because you're a neuroscientist, I mean, this goes on all the time, where you can see the face, but you can't think of the name. What causes that?
This happens to me all the time. I call them my islands of idiocy. Yeah, they're my islands of idiocy, where I can remember sort of 90% of something, but I can't remember one aspect of it. And it's typically the thing that is so important to the conversation that I'm having, like, what was that actor's name? And actually, it's something that happens to everybody. And I think it's just because, a movie, like the rest of life, is very complicated. And to put all the pieces together, we often don't remember the movie as a convergent whole, as the whole thing. I mean, we might remember the plot in that way, but we don't necessarily remember the names of all the actors and the actresses, and we don't necessarily remember the soundtrack, and often different parts of it we remember for different reasons. And it's probably due to the way that we lay down our memories about a movie. When you watch a movie, you might halfway through think, oh, this is a very familiar soundtrack. I think this must be John Williams, and that might give you a very specific memory related to John Williams, and you might forever remember that Star Wars or whatever you're watching. Exactly.
Indiana Jones. I compose music for TV and film, so
oh,
yeah.
Good.
I thought you were going to say Hans Zimmer, but that's okay.
So then you make that link, right? You've got that particular link, but the link may not also be made with the actors that are in that movie, because you might not have something to hang it on to, right? You might not have a memory, a prior memory to relate it to. And complex experiences like watching a movie, or indeed pretty much anything that we do in our lives, are like this, that there are things that happen that are very familiar to us. And again, this is something I talk about in the book, where we say, that's like this, and somehow that gets tagged in memory as being something that's related to something else. And much of our memory is relational. And where there isn't something to relate it to, it's often much harder to remember. Conversely, when there's a lot to relate it to, it can get confusing and can be harder to remember. If Harrison Ford is in the movie, it can make it quite difficult to remember what the movie is, because he's in lots of movies, right? In ways that maybe very prominent actors that are in fewer movies, it might be easier to relate them to that particular movie. And that's just a function of the way our memory works.
Thank you for that answer. That was terrific. I'm going to get esoteric again. A few weeks ago, I had a fellow by the name of Dr. Kababa, and he was talking about emergency room doctors and some of their experiences. One of the experiences, one of the doctors had a patient pass away, I should say, on the emergency table. You've heard stories like this a million times. The patient was brought back to life, and the patient, as you described to a T in every minute detail, was above and watching what was going on. Is the mind capable of doing something like that, or is this just some kind of paranormal hocus pocus, or your opinion?
My opinion is that there isn't any irrefutable scientific evidence to support these sorts of experiences. And that's not to say that people don't even have the sense that that's happening. They certainly do. But many of us have the sense of all sorts of extraordinary things happening in the world. Think about if you'd had a few more IPAs, you might have started to imagine all sorts of things, or and that might be as simple as, time passing at a different rate, or, whatever. But, I think the problem with these sorts of descriptions is they're very difficult to study scientifically, because they don't occur in the lab. So nobody is measuring everything and making sure that it is exactly as it appeared to be. And I guess a typical example is the sense that, we've all heard stories about people being able to read a sign that was on the top of a filing cabinet, and they could have only read that sign if they'd been floating above themselves. And my understanding of that literature is that these things are extremely difficult to replicate, have proven to be difficult to replicate, and by and large they aren't quite what they appear to be. And that, again, is not to say that people don't have this sense of floating above themselves, or the feeling that they are floating away, or seeing a light at the end of a tunnel. I'm sure all that stuff actually happens, but whether it is translated into an actual event that the person can be placed above themselves, looking down at the room in a way that can be scrutinized scientifically, survives scientific scrutiny, I would say that's generally not the case.
We've got a few minutes left. I should tell you about Dr. Michael. He's up at Laurentian University. He's got something called the God helmet. And what he does is he puts his helmet on you with all kinds of little magnetic sensors on it, and he just slightly little pulls here, little pulls there, and what he's trying to do is recreate a paranormal experience. He's had mixed results, to put it mildly. Some people say they see the UFO, some people say they see the ghost, and vice versa. Now, I had the helmet on, he never turned it on, thank goodness. I may have seen an IPA. Who knows? This is a recurring joke, by the way. This is called arcing a joke, by the way, folks. It's fascinating to me. The mind is fascinating because, we always talk about space. Here's another film metaphor. It's the final frontier. I think perhaps the mind is. I don't think we've actually captured the whole picture we can do with mind. I even did some remote viewing. I'm a skeptic on this stuff, and it actually worked. It scared me, so your opinion on that type of thing, is that a way we should go? To me, if you can take a snapshot of a scene, and feelings included, and translate that to a patient that is in a vegetative state, the immediacy of that, instead of trying to describe things and all that nature, to me that would be an interesting way to communicate.
Well, I think that is a very interesting idea, and I think it's certainly one that has legs, if you like, in the sense that for many of these patients, traditional forms of communication aren't going to prove useful. And I think you actually don't have to jump straight into the really difficult situation of the vegetative state. Think about somebody that is extremely deaf, for example. There amazingly sophisticated things are being done with cochlear implants and other ways of getting sound into the person's brain. Similarly, with vision, we are now at approaching a time where visual images can be.
That's the music. I'm so sorry. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, though. This has been fantastic. Don't be a stranger. You come to Kingston, the IPA's on me. You see how you close that out? The Gray Zone, a neuroscientist explores the border between life and death. Adrian Owen. As always, find the book on our website. Order it right from the comfort of your own home. Thank you so much, Adrian. The best team of yours. I'm Brent Holland from The Brent Holland Show. See you all next time.